Advanced HE Student Surveys Guide, Pre-Population Fields in Depth. So this guide looks at our pre-populated fields in more depth to understand what they do. And we're going to return to the PTES Guide worksheet in the Surveys Coding Guide. The first field to look at is email, which is mandatory for all three surveys. A valid email is needed for every respondent, as it acts as a unique identifier for JISC, along with allowing emails to be sent from the JISC Online Surveys platform if desired. Whilst the student email address acts as an identifier on the JISC Online Surveys platform, it isn't saved alongside student responses as an identifier. For that, you'll need to use a student ID field, which we'll come to later. We can see how the email address is used in JISC by exploring the Access Control screen in the Distribute tab of Online Surveys. Here we see that Access Control is managed through an email list. We can use the email address to invite respondents. But it's also how JISC defines a unique respondent. Also pre-populated here are the ID, which is pre-populated through the field Respondent ID, and Password, pre-populated through the field Password. These fields are used for the login screen that is shown to students if they click on a generic link to the survey rather than a unique link sent direct to them. The Respondent ID and Password fields are optional, but using a generic link that can be used in publicity and forwarded by staff alongside unique links sent via email, this can be very effective at raising response rates. There's more information on the next guide and on other help resources. We've already covered discipline in the last guide, which needs to be pre-populated in PTES and UKES because it's always hidden in these surveys. We can see this on the survey build screen. By contrast, in PRES, the discipline field will be shown if it isn't pre-populated, as shown here on the PRES guide. The pre-population of discipline in PRES isn't mandatory, and students will see the question if not pre-populated. However, the question still has a lot of options, and for some programs, PGRs may find it difficult to allocate themselves, or their self-allocation might not match what the department expects. Pre-populating discipline, as shown on the example PRES CSV format, is therefore recommended if possible. The next few fields discussed in this guide cover different routing functions for PTES and PRES, which give optionality for these surveys. As covered in the guide to building our survey, UKES handles optionality by allowing us to delete unwanted fields and sections. The routing question in PTES is mandatory because if it is not pre-populated, the dissertation, support, skills and resources sections in PTES are hidden by default. This said, you can still hide these sections if you like. Let's have a look at the routing question in the survey. Here, we can see that the routing question in PTES has an option for each combination of sections, for dissertation and resources, for example. There's also the option to not run any of the optional sections. To show the sections we want, it's just a matter of pre-populating the routing question appropriately. Here is the routing question on the example CSV. The routing works on a per-student basis, which can be useful in routing students for whom the dissertation section might not apply. It's good to check the routing is working properly by testing student links when the survey is launched. This is on the next video. In PTES and PRES, there is a follow-up question to that on disability, asking about the extent to which reasonable adjustments are suitable for student needs. Some institutions indicated they would prefer not to ask this question, so there is an option to pre-populate. The adjustments field pre-populates this question, and the question is hidden if it is pre-populated. If an institution doesn't want to show the follow-up question, then a column headed with adjustments can be added to the CSV and pre-populated with not applicable. The open comment boxes under scales in PTES and PRES are also hidden by pre-population. These comment boxes are hidden if any value is pre-populated in the comments field. We can see this by viewing which questions are associated with our pre-population parameters. Here on the Distribute Launch screen, we can see that the comments field is associated with all the open comment boxes under the scales, and pre-populating any value will hide them all. The following fields on the survey's coding guide, from age to mode, all follow the principle that pre-population needs to match the options on the question. The values used need to match those on the appropriate allowed worksheet, mapping from institutional data, where possible. See the previous guide for more on mapping. It's good to note that if you're not pre-populating a field, then you don't need to include that field in your CSV for upload to JISC. Here, the values for sex and trans fields are not pre-populated, they're empty. So the CSV can leave these fields out. Next, we come to a question that was particularly important in the pandemic, being the way that teaching was expected to be delivered on the course. This question is hidden because it isn't about the experience of teaching delivery, but how it was intended to be delivered. This question about intended teaching delivery, which suggests what students might expect, can be usefully combined with the question on perceived experience of teaching delivery. Here, on the example CSV worksheet, we can see the delivery field question pre-populated. Where it isn't pre-populated, then, as the question is always hidden, this field and the intended teaching question will be blank. Let's turn to the next three fields, shown here on the example CSV format worksheet. These are optional fields that can be used to pre-populate information about course, department and faculty. This information will therefore be on the dataset, allowing immediate analysis. However, you may have noticed that one of these fields is being used for a different purpose in the example. These fields can contain any text up to 255 characters, so can be used for other purposes, such as personalizing JISC emails. However, please be aware that Advance HE receives data in these fields. You can see these fields on the survey on the final page of the template, before any institutional questions. Following them is the Student ID field, which allows an identifier to be placed on the dataset associated with the student response. The Student ID field is for where you wish to run the survey confidentially, such that any reporting is anonymized, but where there is an identifier on the dataset. The Student ID field is the only individual identifier included on your JISC dataset, and this field isn't shared with Advance HE. To reiterate, the email and respondent ID fields are used to identify students on the JISC system and control access, but they are not saved on the dataset with the student response. Only the Student ID field allows the student response to be tied back to other institutional data, and our advice is to pre-populate the Student ID field with a student identifier unless you want to run the survey anonymously. That's a run-through of all the pre-population fields that are set up with the JISC template, but they are not the only pre-population fields you can use. Let's go to the Settings screen in the Build tab and then click to edit our pre-population parameters. This dialog shows us the pre-population parameters used on the survey and, crucially, allows us to add more parameters. Here, I'm adding a parameter field called campus, and I'll save. Now I'll go back to the Builder screen and along to my Institutional Questions page and add a single line question. I add the text campus to make clear what it is and go into Settings. Clicking on Pre-population Parameters. In this dialog, I select the parameter I've just created and indicate that it should always be hidden. Here we can see the question I've created, which is pre-populated by my new parameter and always hidden. This new parameter could be used to pre-populate an email or have information on the dataset when it's downloaded from JISC. We can also use pre-population parameters to populate our institutional questions in the same way as for other questions on the survey. Here, the new campus field is used to pre-populate a question, and then used to route the institutional question on study space. And we can see the routing at work here. The new parameter is pre-populated as with our other pre-population parameters. We have our field name at the top and our pre-populated values underneath, with some missing. And depending on how we've set things up, the student can then see the question, or the question can remain hidden. Our data is formatted, ready to be saved as a CSV and uploaded to the JISC survey platform. We're nearly ready to launch the survey, which is covered in the next video guide.